Thank you. It was at a dinner that you hosted a couple months ago that I raised what I thought was a not terribly ambitious goal, suggesting that those in the center-right should have a conversation about the costs and the benefits, the purposes, and the end goals of the American occupation of Afghanistan, and to ask, what are we doing and how long are we staying and what's it going to cost? And there was some criticism, but we did, I think, in the center-right, begin to get a conversation going. And I want to first talk about sort of why we didn't have a robust conversation over the last 10 years and why it's difficult getting it going. And I think there are a couple reasons. One is there's no draft. So there are a whole bunch of people who don't have skin in the game and who don't enter the conversation. Part of it was that it started under Bush's watch, and Republicans were reflexively just supporting the president. And, of course, Republicans all cheerfully voted for Bush when he said we're going to have a humbler foreign policy and not get wrapped around the axle on places that you can't pronounce, and in Yugoslavia and Somalia. We weren't going to be doing that sort of thing anymore. And Republicans said, fine, yes, good. And then when he decided not simply to knock out the Taliban government and try and kill the leadership of al-Qaeda, but decided to stay and turn Afghanistan into Kansas, people continued to say, okay. And there wasn't a conversation that, wait a minute, we went from kinder, gentler to jumping on top of another country and occupying a rather large country with a history of not being appreciative of being occupied, and getting involved in all sorts of tribal matters that perhaps we didn't understand as well as we might. And yet, because it was sort of a Republican president doing, a lot of Republicans said, okay, and let it slide, and you didn't have a conversation. Then you also had something that seemed to me sort of the flip side of Vietnam, where Republicans, center-right people, remembered the left being very harsh in their criticism of American troops during Vietnam, and all of a sudden, support the troops became the phrase that was used when the actual statement was, stop questioning the president's policies, okay? And it was as if you didn't wish to continue the occupation of Afghanistan, then somehow you were like for leaving the American troops there and taking the food and the weapons and the supplies with you home and leaving them in, I'm not sure anybody had suggested that, but somehow if you weren't for the policy, you weren't for the troops. And I think kind of runs the other way. If you're not being supportive of the troops, if you're not thinking through how best to protect them and to make their work and their sacrifice worthwhile and successful. Now, normally you'd think conservatives, center-right, elected officials, activists, who demand a cost-benefit analysis of every EPA regulation, as they ought, haven't been making the same request when lives are at stake and a great deal of money, $100 billion or more to occupy a country whose GDP is not $100 billion. And then we have the question of, on the center-right, what is the conservative foreign policy? And I think since the end of the Cold War, since Reagan, that's not clear. I mean, you could make a list of things that what do Republicans or Reagan Republicans think on the Second Amendment, on taxes, on spending. You can write those down, and you have just about unanimity on a number of those issues. But when you get to foreign policy, it's a big question mark. Again, Bush could have gone either way. Ronald Reagan decided not to occupy Lebanon when our Marines were hit in Lebanon. He didn't say, we will now stay and manage your civil war here for you for the next 15 years. He actually said, we're not going to stay and be in the middle of your civil war. And the Lebanese had a perfectly fine civil war all by themselves. It didn't require our supervision or our financing, and it ended no better or worse than it would have if we'd sat on top of it and then left one day. So is there an opportunity, is there a reason for optimism that perhaps we can have a conversation on the right, a useful conversation. I think, yes, for a couple reasons. There was some interesting polling data that said 2/3 of conservatives think everything we've done to Afghanistan up until now has been worthwhile, which is sort of respecting the troop sacrifice, deferring to Bush's judgment. And then 2/3 also want to do something radically different in the future. Okay. You might look at that and say, what happened last week that makes that make sense? But I think it does make sense if people don't want to dishonor the sacrifice or get into a conversation about, have we been wasting money and lives for some time now? But, okay, setting that aside, now, looking forward, what do we want to do? Something dramatically different. And that gives us an opening that if we don't spend a lot of time trashing Obama and Bush's decisions up until this point and instead focus on why are we here, what are we doing, what's the benefit, what are the costs of continuing this, and what are the opportunity costs? I mean, if we weren't spending the lives and troops and money there, what could we be doing with the time and the effort? You know, so one, the public is willing to have a new conversation. Two, for the center-right, this is, as Ann pointed out, this is now Obama's war, so this should be sort of ollie in free. Everybody on the right is now allowed to think for themselves on this subject. We're not following the Republican president in this conversation. And with the increase of the number of troops, it's actually become a different operation and a much more expensive one. I emceed a panel discussion at Cato with 3 Republican congressmen a number of months ago, and I asked them off the record, in private, what percentage of Republican members of Congress believed the continuation of our sitting on top of Iraq was a wise move, not knocking out the dictator, but staying and managing and being on top of Iraq, a shoestring from Afghanistan to Iraq. And the 3 of them said, all. I think it was a mistake. And I made them answer the question again, because I was expecting 10, 20, 50, who knows. They said all. And so you have this conversation among Republicans who don't feel they have, on the House and Senate, who don't think they have permission yet, somehow, to ask tough questions, and yet that's breaking free. So I think there's some real opportunities, and again, reason for optimism. There is no political structure within the Republican. If somebody said, I think it'd be a really good idea to go steal people's guns, I can assure you that within the Republican Party and the conservative movement, there's a structure that says, no, 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 you're not allowed to do that. I happen to manage the structure that says, and don't be raising taxes either. But there isn't anything within the center-right which draws lines in the sand on a foreign policy of a question like Afghanistan. If a Republican presidential candidate said, I think we should shift and decide not to occupy Afghanistan for the next 10, 20, 30 years, there may be 5 op-ed writers who would send him nasty notes, but there's no vote against that. There's no primary you lose. There's no structure or institution that draws a line in the sand and would want to have this knockdown, drag-out fight. So for all those reasons, I think we have begun belatedly. And I tried to go through why did it take so long? Why is it still taking a while? Why hasn't it moved faster? But why is there optimism to think that we can have these steps forward? And again, the inarticulateness of the criticism and of you by those people who said you can't do that. When I suggested we have a conversation, Max Boots said that was laughable to ask for a conversation. And a couple of the guys said, well, Grover's just called for leaving Afghanistan tomorrow. Let's see. I suggest we should have an open conversation about the costs and the benefits, and the people who are advocates of the status quo believe that if you had a conversation about the costs and the benefits, everyone would want to leave. That's not exactly showing a robust defense of their position in life, and it reminds one of the old joke of Honecker, the East German dictator who, towards the end of East Germany, turned to his wife, or his wife turned to him rather and said, why don't you open the Berlin Wall and open it up? And he was kind of surprised because she was pretty loyal communist and everything. And finally, then he smiled, he goes, oh, you just want to be alone with me. Because he had sort of taken the several steps and decided if you opened up, everyone would leave, which is not exactly showing a great deal of faith in his creation in East Germany. And again, those who want to argue for the status quo or a version of the status quo with the occupation of Afghanistan, who want to try and shout down a conversation, are really telling you that not that we believe they have no arguments. I'm open to listening to their arguments. I've been waiting 10 years for an explanation and an argument about why this makes sense, and I'm open to that. But they evidently don't think they have any. And that's kind of damning when you think about it. Thank you.
Grover, thank you very much.